Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to Christmas Advent day number 7. Today I'm going to do a short demonstration on how you can draw and blend your fur using a solvent. So the solvent of my choice today is going to be the Zest-It pencil blend. Before we begin, if you want to watch this tutorial and all of the other fur tutorials and a bunch of others in real time with full voiceover, then head on over to my Patreon page. These ones are available for the $10 tier. All of the materials that I've used in this short demonstration are listed in the description below should you wish to check those out. So as I mentioned, I'm using the Zest-It for my demonstration. I'm using the Zest-It blending sponge and I'm using the Zest-It that has the citrus smell to it. I'm just using an ordinary paintbrush. I'm using a round paintbrush just to apply the solvent to the paper. So the first thing that we need to do before you add any solvent or do any type of blending to the piece, we need to add some base layers. And when you're using a solvent blender, it's always good to have quite a number of layers down of the pencil that you're using before you go in and start blending with the solvent. That's just because it ensures that there's enough pigment down onto the paper to have an adequate blend. So what I'm doing is I'm just layering down some warm grey one. The fur colour that I'm going to be rendering with the solvent is a black fur. So I just put a couple layers down of the warm grey one. Then I went in with a cold grey one just to build up the base tone a little bit. And then I'm going over and shading some dark sepia. So all of the layers that I've done up to now have been shading. So I've just been moving my pencil back and forth, creating soft lines and a soft colour lay down using very light pressure on my pencil. It's really important that you always use light pressure when you're building up your layers as well, and that you keep your pencil really nice and sharp. So I'm just making sure that I got down a smooth layer of colour. Then I'm going in with my blender, so I'm going in with the Citrus Zest-It, and I'm just going to start to blend out these layers. So I've built up, I think, 4 or 5 layers here of colour so far. So what I'm doing is I'm making sure that my paintbrush is quite wet with the blender. The paintbrush isn't dripping wet, so you don't get drips or blobs coming off the paintbrush, but it's not entirely dry either. It's somewhere in between, just got a nice amount on the paintbrush, so it's nice and glossy, it holds all the bristles together. And what I'm doing is just going back and forth in the direction that that fur is going in, and I'm making ever such slight circular motions as well, and that's just to try and move all of the pigment and binder on the paper into the tooth of the paper, so you get a really nice smooth blend. When you're using a solvent blender, it's always good to use more solvent to begin with and then gradually get less and less. So once we've applied the solvent, I then made sure that I waited for the solvent to dry completely. So I just waited 10 to 15 minutes just to make sure that it had dried completely so that I could add a further layer of pencil. So once that had dried, I added a further layer of the dark sepia, again just using the shading motion just to try and fill some more of the grain of the paper. You can see that mine's quite patchy, and that's just where I've blended with the solvent and it's gone quite grainy, where there aren't quite enough layers built up. The great thing about using a solvent is that you can add multiple layers over the top. Because it dissolves the pigment and the binder of the pencil, you get rid of that waxy residue that builds up when you're building up your layers, and it dissolves it into the tooth of the paper. So then when you come to add more layers, it's like the paper is new again. So it's like you're adding your very first layer, because you've preserved the tooth of the paper where you've used light layers, and then you've blended it out so you've got rid of all that waxiness with the solvent. So once I've added a shading layer of the dark sepia, I've then gone in and started to add some of my fur lines. So in my case, I've drawn my fur quite long and I'm going to make it a little bit wavy. So I've just used similar strokes to mimic that kind of fur. Once I've done the fur strokes, I'm then going in with a second layer of the solvent. So I'm blending out once more. This time I'm making sure that the paintbrush isn't quite as wet as it was when I blended out the first time, so you want to make sure that you use less solvent the more layers that you build. Using less solvent when you have more layers limits the amount that it's going to move around on your paper. If you use a lot of solvent when you've built up your layers quite a lot, then it often moves the pigment around and you can get quite a patchy look. So if you use less solvent, you have less chance of it actually doing that. So again, after I'd used the solvent, I made sure that I let it dry for 10 to 15 minutes. Once it's dry, your piece tends to look a little bit darker in tone. Once it's dry, I then go over with another layer of the dark sepia. So this time, again, I'm adding some fur lines, just going in the direction of the fur, making sure that I start to build up my dark areas and start to bring in my highlights. So I'm bringing in the highlights with a Caran d'Ache Luminance white pencil with this. You'll find that when you use a solvent, it is much easier to get that white pencil over the top of your darker colours. So I'm just using a very light pressure on my Caran d'Ache Luminance white, and it's coming off on the paper really quite well. I'm not putting any pressure through it at all. By blending out with that solvent, again, it's dissolved all of that waxy build-up, so all of the pigment and binders blended into the paper so you can easily add colours over the top. That includes all of your light colours. So you don't necessarily have to use a Caran d'Ache Luminance white. I could have also used the Prismacolor white, that's also an opaque white that I favour, but you can use any white. I also find that the Polychromos white actually goes over dark colours when you have blended out using a solvent. So once I've added in a few highlights and I've darkened up a few places to where I want them to be, I'm then going over with the Caran d'Ache Luminance white and adding in some of these wispy kind of lines. So you get this sort of flyaway kind of depth look to the fur. And then going back over with some dark sepia, really darkening up some of the areas that I want to be dark. So I'm darkening up the areas underneath those highlight areas. Once I've added a couple more layers, I'm then going in with some more solvent. So again, as I'm building up the layers, I'm using less and less solvent on my brush. So I'm just gently blending everything out, just going back and forth, working in the direction that the fur is going in. I don't want to work in the opposite direction because it will blend in a weird way. You want to work in the direction that the fur is going in. So always make sure that you blend following the direction of your fur. So now I'm going in with some of my final layers, and you can see the difference to now from where we started. So when we first started blending, it looked quite patchy, quite liney and quite grainy still, but now that we're adding in this pencil layer, you can see that it's all starting to look quite smooth and I've got a really dark rich colour going on. So I'm just adding in some more lines, shading here and there, just really darkening everything up. I'm going back in with the Caran d'Ache Luminance white and just adding a few more of these highlighted hairs, making it look like these really light hairs are sitting on top of the black fur. I also add a little bit of a black pencil here because I find that when I use a solvent blender, as it darkens the tone of your colours as it dries, I often need to use a black pencil for the really dark parts because the dark sepia just cannot get that really dark tone that I'm after. So I use the Caran d'Ache Luminance black pencil just to add that really dark rich colour. So once I've finished with the black and just added in as much contrast as I need, I can also glaze over the top some colours that I can see in the fur. So in this case I added in a little bit of blue, so I used a Caran d'Ache blue pencil just to glaze a little bit of the blue colour over the top. Again, this is really easily done because we've blended out with that solvent and got rid of all of that waxy build-up. So if I didn't use a solvent blender, I would find it incredibly hard to add the white pencil over the top. I'd also find it increasingly harder to add layers as we go on. So using the solvent blender makes it a lot easier for yourself to layer, and you don't have to use hard pressure through your pencil either. You can continue to use light pressure. That's really great if you have delicate wrists or you struggle to put a lot of pressure through your pencil without it snapping or something like that. So that's the fur complete and the end of this short tutorial. Hopefully you have enjoyed this one and found it useful to apply some things to your own work. I would love to know if there is anything that you would like me to review or any kind of tips or techniques that you would like me to go over when drawing fur or animals. Pop a comment below with what you would like to see pop up on this channel. If you haven't done so already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and tick that bell icon as well so you can be notified of each Advent video as soon as it's released. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you in tomorrow's Advent video. Bye!